The 1950s are really a strange decade in American history, primarily because the political establishment rests on a series of fundamental contradictions. The Eisenhower administration represented an ascendant political conservatism in American politics, but the Eisenhower administration also represented a continuation of New Deal style of politics that mostly entailed large government expenditures and programs. The groundswell of this conservative movement also was built on the anti-communism of the previous decade. But it was Eisenhower who ultimately undermined Joseph McCarthy's campaign for weeding out supposed communist subversives in American government. Finally, under Eisenhower, the state supported a repopulation initiative, culminating in what is known as the baby boom. But it's ultimately the children of this baby boom who undermined state authority through political activism through the 1960s. Through the Eisenhower administration's continuation of big government programs like the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, to a pervasive car culture tied to consumerism that proliferates under the Eisenhower administration. The 1950s are critical for understanding the modern America. So in this lecture, we'll talk about how the 1950s really represented the golden age of American capitalism, where through state-sponsored repopulation initiatives and the repercussions of New Deal policies like the Federal Loan Bank Act, or New Deal policies that incentivize suburbanization, American capitalism never looked so good in American history. It really was an age of affluence. But like the Gilded Age, another previous era of affluence that we talked about, this era is not without its own misgivings and dark underside. In the 1950s, the American government finally picked up on this pursuit of civil rights, particularly black civil rights, that had been a mainstay of activism since the Reconstruction era. But the state was only willing to support civil rights so long as it would preserve and continue its own foreign policy initiatives within this global Cold War framework with the Soviet Union. And so the civil rights advances that take place in the 1950s were limited. And we'll see how this global Cold War framework limited dissent and activism, particularly for African American citizenship. And it wasn't until the 1960s, the next lecture, that we'll talk about this another proliferation of activism like that of the Progressive Era, seeking to address the limitations of the previous era. Riding on the tide of anti-communist politics, Dwight D. Eisenhower, vice presidential candidate Richard Nixon, won an overwhelming majority of electoral votes in 1952, and won again in 1956. Establishing what is known as the Eisenhower era, the breadth of the Eisenhower administration through the 1950s. As a politician, Dwight Eisenhower was relatively inexperienced, but nonetheless he was a revered war hero. This was exactly who Americans thought should be in power during this Cold War era, when it seemed as though we were going to go into World War III at any given moment against the Soviet Union. Eisenhower projected this image of an honest man thrust into public service, and this is what made him so appealing to common voters throughout America. Richard Nixon, although relatively inexperienced in his own right, made a name for himself in the past decade as an anti-communist agitator, just like Joseph McCarthy. Although strange bedfellows in many respects, Eisenhower and Nixon created a platform of modern republicanism in America. Although strange bedfellows along many lines, Eisenhower and Nixon created a modern conservative platform that would follow through the rest of the century, which stipulated a small federal government and reducing the size of federal expenditure, while also enhancing military expenditures so as to project a strong international image for America. Eisenhower and Nixon both lived through the Great Depression. And so at the very center of their administration was the preservation of American capitalism in the free market. The 1950s was the golden age of American capitalism, and this rested on the fact that the Eisenhower administration continued many of the New Deal policies under FDR and Truman. For example, they continued agricultural subsidies to farms. They continued Social Security benefits. They continued the Tennessee Valley Authority. They also continued increased spending for public housing, as well as creating new agencies like the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. This was an era of big government that was supporting capitalism. But the primary impetus for supporting capitalism and free market enterprise was primarily to boost the international image as well as enhance the military power of America in opposition to the Soviet Union. And we'll see a little bit later in this lecture how initiatives like the Federal Highway Act in 1956 served those exact purposes, both capitalism and foreign policy interest. In the immediate post-war era, we see an immense suburban housing boom. This suburban housing boom built on many of the New Deal policies laid by FDR, but were continued by Truman and now under Eisenhower as well. Between 1950 and 1970, about 7 million white Americans left cities for suburbs. Meanwhile, 3 million black Americans moved from the South and the North in this movement, which is known as the second wave of the Great Migration. And once in these northern cities, increased the size of existing urban ghettos and creating entirely new ones in some respects as well. In these intervening years, nearly 500,000 Puerto Ricans also moved to these cities. For the most part, however, suburbs in America were primarily constructed as white zones, white spaces, because of the restrictions of New Deal policies. And residents of these suburbs recognized this as white space. In the 1950s, Life magazine quoted a white suburbanite discussing a prospective black neighbor. He says, "He's probably a nice guy, but every time I see him, I see $2,000 drop off the value of my house." For white suburbanites, home ownership, single home ownership, represented an emblem of freedom. And racial inclusion, racial integration, represented a threat to the value of home ownership. Home ownership was a major investment, and white suburbanites were fearful that racial integration would lower the quality of life in the suburbs and subsequently decrease the value of their property, decrease the value of this investment, and decrease the value of the freedom that they had acquired through home ownership. New suburban planned communities like Levittown, the namesake of the development company, Levitt and Sons, represented the epitome of the American dream, a fresh start and a commitment to family, community, and America itself. Through state-sponsored advertisement and government subsidies, the Eisenhower administration stipulated this vision of suburban life that was critical to American democracy and freedom abroad, and overall projected this image of American superiority in opposition to the Soviet Union. Many people living through the 1950s considered it a pro-family era, in which marriage and childbirth was almost universally praised. The baby boom corresponds to this exponential increase in birth rates from the Depression era, where birth rates nearly doubled, and families were more willing to have third and fourth children. And many Americans, primarily white Americans living in the suburbs, were able to provide for those children primarily because of this age of affluence, this golden age of capitalism, where wages exponentially increased, corresponding to birth rates. It's important to understand as well that advertising at this time reflected many of these pro-family values that was supported by the state. Gender roles in the 1950s were re-entrenched, and those unwilling to fulfill those traditional gender roles, especially women, were suspected of being homosexual, neurotic, emotionally immature, or too involved with their career, or simply irresponsible. Nonetheless, they were considered social outcasts. Americans derived social cues from the advertising and television programming that they saw every night. And for that matter, television as a medium of communication proliferated during the 1950s, when television technology itself became more affordable for most Americans, especially those living in the suburbs. By 1950, only 9% of American households had televisions. By 1960, that number increased to 90% of American households. Most people watch television at least 5 hours a day, if not more. And the content of the television they watch also mattered. Television sitcoms like Father Knows Best or Leave It to Beaver or even the Donna Reed Show reflected these pro-family values. And so looking back in the 1950s, the happy, homogeneous families that we remember were partly a result of the media's lack of diversity. These television shows exhibited ideal middle-class values, white, working class, earnest fathers, and attractive fathers, while the mother was often savvy and ran the household. So these TV shows reflected the pro-family values that the state supported during the 1950s. The traditional family, as one notable scholar has argued, is really a figment of our imagination. Okay? We are misremembering this And this idea of the idyllic suburban family is really a media construct. The Federal Highway Act of 1956 served two purposes. On the first part, it connected many of these suburban communities that developed in the 1950s. On the other hand, it also served foreign policy interests. The Eisenhower administration spent $32 billion on the construction of an interstate highway system that we now rely on. And the purpose of this highway system was to meet the needs of new automobile owners in the 1950s. But it was also to structure a unique transportation system for military personnel and materiel. And this is something that Eisenhower saw in the European theater of conflict during World War I. As he approached the German front lines in World War II, Eisenhower took note of the systemic routes of transportation that the Nazi Germany had constructed through the Autobahn. And he also took note of the fact that this Autobahn facilitated two purposes. Number one, the development of land through suburbanization of Germany, but also through military transport during the war. The omnipresent threat of the Soviet Union invading and dominating the United States was always in Eisenhower's mind. And so part of the impetus of the Federal Highway Act of 1956 was primarily to serve as a contingency plan if the Soviet Union had invaded. And as we'll talk about in the next lecture, it seemed as though the Soviet Union was encroaching on the Western sphere of influence, particularly encroaching on the domestic security of continental United States. One of the paradoxes of the 1950s that we illustrated at the beginning of this lecture was that even though it was conservative, it continued many of the big government expenditures and programs that were iconic of the New Deal era. For example, the Housing Act passed in Congress in 1949 authorized the construction of more than 800,000 public housing units to provide, quote, a decent home for every American family. This is quintessentially a New Deal policy that proliferated under the Eisenhower administration. Under the Eisenhower administration, however, public housing was increasingly confined to segregated neighborhoods in inner cities, reinforcing this concentration of poverty in the wake of suburban exodus. At the same time, under government programs like so-called urban renewal, city governments demolished poor neighborhoods that occupied real estate that was potentially valuable for development. In place of these poor neighborhoods that were literally razed by demolition, developers constructed consumer centers and public universities that served middle-class interests. For example, when the Brooklyn Dodgers left for the West Coast, the city of Los Angeles demolished the working-class neighborhood of Chavez Ravine, a mixed-income, mixed-ethnic community. And the movement of the Dodgers from Brooklyn to LA also represented this preeminence of the West Coast that reflected the rising conservative values from politicians like Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. There's another side of Eisenhower's America. While the standard of living increased for many white Americans living in the suburbs, poverty was just another facet of life for black Americans that had moved to the cities. Non-white employment in Eisenhower's America reached 40%. And in the next decade, in the 1960s, non-white poverty became a rallying cry for civil rights activism. At the same time, the modern civil rights movement comes into fruition. In 1954, the Brown v. Board of Ed Supreme Court decision challenges the standard of separate but equal established under Plessy v. Ferguson. A black father sued the Kansas Board of Ed to allow his daughter to attend a white-only school, challenging this white supremacy that had emanated throughout the South since 1877. The case reached all the way to the Supreme Court, in which Thurgood Marshall, a NAACP lawyer at the time, challenged the precept of separate but equal, claiming that it was inherently contradictory, that segregated educational facilities, even if physically similar, could never yield equal results because of the white supremacy politics in the South during that time. The Supreme Court, under the leadership of Earl Warren, decided separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, and by decree of the federal law, mandated the integration of Southern schools, first unenforced, but then requiring federal intervention. White supremacy in the South immediately opposed this decision with their own Southern Manifesto, issued in 1956, in which Southern congressional representatives proudly pledged their opposition to the Brown versus Board of Ed decision. Despite this Southern Manifesto, schools immediately started to integrate. In September of 1957, the Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas was scheduled to integrate for the first time. A mob of protesters stood in the way of these children attempting to enter the school. When these children and their families attempted to integrate the school in Little Rock, Arkansas, a large mob, including National Guardsmen and police officers, confronted these children, roaring, lynch them, spitting on the kids. At first, Little Rock, Arkansas remained segregated, but Eisenhower, conscious of his international image in opposition to the Soviet Union, Eisenhower nationalized the Arkansas National Guard and dispatched 1,000 troops of the 101st Airborne to reinforce this mandate of integration. Similarly, in 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott also attempted to change Southern society. In December 1st, 1955, reminiscent of the Plessy versus Ferguson case, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man on a public bus. She was immediately harassed and arrested by local law enforcement officials. In response, African American political organizers throughout the state of Alabama called for a bus boycott to begin on the day of Rosa Parks' court appearance. It is at this moment that Martin Luther King Jr. appears as one of the preeminent civil rights leaders of the 1950s. King arrives in Montgomery and asks the crowd to boycott the buses, urging his listeners to protest, quote, courageously and yet with dignity and Christian love, and when confronted with violence, to bless those people who perpetrate that violence. In the end, Rosa Parks was found guilty and fined $14. Fundamentally, however, the bus boycott in Montgomery shattered this image, this national image that blacks in the South accepted segregation willingly. 1955 marked the beginning of a pattern of non-violent civil rights protests. The initial energy generated in 1955 would lead to further efforts through the 1950s and 1960s to expand black citizenship. In all, the Eisenhower administration did little to ameliorate the racial animosity that was intensifying across the country in the 1950s. Civil rights, as one eminent scholar once said, civil rights was a Cold War imperative as far as Eisenhower was concerned. He was willing to support civil rights so long as it would enhance an international image against the Soviet Union. Concessions like the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which established a commission in civil rights and protected black voter rights, was one of these movements towards enhancing a national public image with regard to civil rights. But Eisenhower and other politicians that would follow did very little in respect to restoring the promises of the Reconstruction era. White supremacy in the South was still a quite vital force, a force that we still reckon with. One of the fundamental takeaways of the Eisenhower administration was the way in which it transformed American foreign policy. Eisenhower's administration throughout the 1950s increasingly relied on nuclear deterrence. And that meant the proliferation of nuclear weapons so as to deter Soviet aggression. Eisenhower sought to develop tactical nuclear weapons, build up strategic air power, and employ nuclear weapons so as to deter Soviet. In addition to nuclear deterrence, the Eisenhower administration's foreign policy initiative relied on economic military aid and covert secret operations through the CIA to support U.S. governments around the world in opposition to Soviet influence. By the end of his administration, Eisenhower was particularly geared towards aiding economically Arab nations in the Middle East. One of the most notable examples of this policy took place in Iran. Since the end of the 19th century, British Petroleum, a major player in the oil market around the world, had owned oil fields throughout Iran. By 1952, however, Mohammad Mossadegh, who was democratically elected a prime minister of Iran, sought to nationalize these oil fields and take back the national resources that Iran obtained. Essentially, Mossadegh, once he came into power, wanted to nationalize these oil fields that British Petroleum had owned since the end of the 19th century. And Britain, while relying primarily on these oil fields, appealed to American aid. In April 1953, a CIA-sponsored coup overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh from his office as prime minister, and they established Mohammad Reza Shah as the rightful heir. Reza Shah was immediately a Western-supported candidate who claimed rightful heir to the throne as a descendant of the Persian Empire. In reality, however, Reza Shah was nothing more than a Western-supported puppet dictator of Iran that controlled the oil fields and gave back to the Western powers that put him into power. This Western-backed government remained in power to 1979 when a fundamental Islamic revolution overtook the Reza Shah's dictatorship and established an Islamic rule that reigns to today. When Eisenhower took office, Asia, the continent of Asia, was the focal point of Cold War tensions, primarily with the Korean War. In the early 1950s, the Vietnamese people issued their own War of Independence from colonial French forces. In a movement called the Viet Minh, led by leader Ho Chi Minh, fought for national liberation from the French colonial forces. And they appealed to America first and foremost for this revolutionary aid. Ho Chi Minh, like Mossadegh, revered the American Revolution as a model of revolutionary effort to overthrow a colonial force. And initially, Ho Chi Minh appealed to the American Congress for aid in this revolutionary effort. Congress obviously denied Ho Chi Minh. And rather than support this revolutionary anti-colonial effort, American forces resupplied the French military, effectively paying for more than 78% of the military war effort in French colonies in Vietnam. The Eisenhower administration ultimately dispatched more than 300 military advisors to Vietnam to aid the French military occupation. And this ultimately culminated in 1964 with the dispatch of American military forces, triggering America's involvement in the Vietnam War. The election of 1960 brought new hope to American democracy, both domestic and abroad. John F. Kennedy, a quite youthful candidate in comparison to Richard Nixon, represented a renewal of American commitment to liberty and democracy, whereas Richard Nixon represented a continuation of the Eisenhower administration. In the end, the youthful Kennedy won, representing a juncture in American politics. In his farewell address to the American people, however, President Eisenhower addressed the overwhelming concern of the military-industrial complex, a term that he coined. A vital element in keeping the peace, he said, is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk our own destruction. And you can think that he's talking directly to Soviet Union by this point. However, he warns that we, quote, must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. The potential for disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist through this military-industrial complex. We must never let the weight of this combination of endanger our liberties or democratic process. In this farewell address, Eisenhower is observing the military throughout his life. And during his presidential administration, he observes the confluence between capitalism and military in America. And he realizes the potential danger this confluence has for American democracy. He observes this confluence of defense contracts with corporations that supply military materiel. And he identifies that war is a money-making enterprise, and that we must warn against that because it is a threat to our democracy, both domestic and abroad. The military-industrial complex is too hot an issue for John F. Kennedy to pick up. It's too hot an issue for any other subsequent president administration to pick up, primarily because those defense contracts and those corporations that supply the military materiel also supply the funding for those campaigns, those presidential campaigns that put people in. And so the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower identifies by the end of his administration is yet another power dynamic that we deal with in our present era, where war and aggressive foreign policy is a money-making venture. In all these ways and more, The 1950s represents a landslide of American politics where the modern era is really formed. So some of the key terms in this lecture are Levittown and the way that the state sponsors suburbanization, as well as housing discrimination. The baby boom is also critical in this aspect as well as the Iranian coup in terms of American foreign policy. What is the Brown versus Board of Ed decision and how does that influence civil rights in America, as well as the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr.? Who is Ho Chi Minh? And what are some really important aspects of boomer culture that pervade today?